Airing on Asheville FM 103.3 LPFM in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian broadcasts and podcast emanating out of occupied Chalagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world, and you can find our archives, transcripts, ways to follow us and support us at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org. This week, I spoke with Dr. Alexander Dunlap about a range of topics such as degrowth, green anarchism, the violence of extractivism, questions of the conception of renewable energy, and resistance to ecocide. We covered a lot in our discussion, and he's written a lot on a range of related topics. You can find a selected bibliography of his work linked in our show notes, and by searching ResearchGate, where many PDFs are available, or searching his name on Anarchist Library. Next week, we hope to bring you a conversation with Michael Laufer of the anarchist biohacking crew, the Four Thieves Vinegar Collective, talking about do-it-yourself medical infrastructures.
I'm Dr. Alexander Dunlap. I'm a political ecologist at the Center for Development and the Environment at the University of Oslo, and yeah, we'll keep it evasive. We'll keep it normal.
Evasive. Thanks for speaking, Dr. Alexander. Could you tell us a bit about your areas of research and writing, what they tend to cover, where those studies have taken you, and some of the relationships that you've built?
Yeah. I guess in general, in just like a couple of words, I'd say that I work in environmental conflicts, and that's my main focus. And yeah, I have a whole history that kind of led into this. But at least, I began my PhD in social anthropology by working with Zapotec and Akut people who were fighting wind energy development in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec region of Oaxaca, Mexico. And it was there that I kind of through networks and friends and people that I ended up in a rather highly combative village that was really drawing the line between saying, kind of total rejection, kind of fighting for autonomy, to reject the kind of spread of wind turbines, and specifically on the Bada de Santa Teresa, which was a long, highly biologically diverse area that was kind of where the Pacific connects with a lagoon, so it mixes with salt water and fresh water. And some coastal ecologists say this sandbar took like 10,000 years to form, and they wanted to build 102 wind turbines on it. But in general, that whole area has been hit super hard with wind turbines, about 2,000 at this point, and this was an area where people had risen up and picked up, their machetes, slingshots, and shotguns, and kind of formed their own policia comunitaria to kind of fend this off. And I've talked about this a lot, and then there's an entire book about this that I've done. But so that was kind of the main area where I was more or less educated about actually how serious wind energy development can be, especially towards people who highly value and are connected to the land and subsist from it, And it's at that point that it was kind of a big wake-up call about kind of green capitalism and the implications of that. But there's more to be said about that. But ultimately I did a PhD working in a more or less a conflict area, looking at various impacts of wind energy development on Zapotec and Akut people, and really anyone who lived in those areas. Then the next area I worked was actually led by my friend Andrea Brock, and to just kind of go down to the Hambach coal mine and to really investigate the company. And RWE is what they're called. And people might have heard about them again recently because of the Lützerath struggle, which they just more or less, the Green Party betrayed everyone and sent the police in to really displace them. But we looked at the Hambach coal mine, we looked at RWD, and specifically the strategies they were engaged in, and what we kind of called corporate counterinsurgency strategies to kind of deactivate, pacify, and try to marginalize, kind of support, and also kind of hurt and kind of break down the forest occupation there, where people were living in the forest to prevent the destruction of it from this large world-eating kind of, these giant kind of coal mine diggers. And then after that, I actually, based on invitation from a friend, I was brought to the Valle de Tambo for the Tia Maria copper mine. And what was really interesting about this mine is that the main company running it was Grupo Mexico, which was one of the biggest mining companies and infrastructure companies in Latin America. And they, to power their operations in Mexico and their mining operations in Mexico, they actually had their own wind park in the area I worked in, Oaxaca. And then they own and have concessions over a good part of southwest Peru. And so down there, Southern Copper Peru, since Strong really began trying to move in 2009, and people had risen up in a very serious way, declaring wildcat strikes, blockades, and preventing the mining company from entering, which resulted in severe, state of emergency and political violence and state terrorism against the people trying to protect the agricultural area there. And so I did research there with a friend whose family was from there. And what was interesting in this is to really look at the full kind of web and supply chain of like, okay, we see the operational impact of wind turbines in Oaxaca generating an immense conflict, immense socio-ecological problems. And now, where do these resources come from? From these new magical renewable machines that are going to save the world and mitigate climate change. When you go to copper mines and there's roughly, depending on the model, and there's roughly 6 different types of kind of generators, you're approximately going to need 3 tons of copper per wind turbine. And oftentimes more than that if you're not using rare earth minerals, or if you're using less rare earth minerals, depending on instead of direct drive or the different kind of turbines. But yeah, I got to see really, what's it like trying to open up a copper mine where people don't want it, and they fought severely. And still to this day, the mine has not been opened, and they have kind of resisted for 15 years. And so this is, good on them and impressive. And it's come at a severe loss and attack. And then after that, I was actually invited to France to look at a mega energy transformer at a zone de fond, or what became a zone de fond, and a zone to defend the La Massade. And that way, which means assembly in Occitanie, which is kind of a regional language in southwest France. And there was very interesting because it was an enormous mega transformer that people were resisting, not only for 2 reasons. One, it was going to further spread solar and wind projects, which had been growing rapidly in the area since 2004, when it was actually already energy self-sufficient, the region itself, on hydroelectric projects. But then the second reason that made this a particularly interesting node to resist was that it is actually connecting to a transnational energy corridor through high tension power lines that you could actually trace through 400,000 volt lines down into Morocco and the Western Sahara region. And if you don't know, the Western Sahara region is one of the, quote, last official colonies of Africa in terms of being under proper classical colonial subjugation by Morocco. And this is actually a big controversy if one was to be able to locate if that energy is really being imported into Europe. However, this is very difficult given the way the energy is produced and goes into the grid. But so I more or less spent 2 years first looking at that site until La Massade was brutally suppressed and broken down by 200 riot police and 2 armored transport tanks and excavators. I've written a lot of stuff about this. But so I did that and then traced all the conflicts related along those power lines as far as I could during COVID, where eventually I couldn't get further south than Granada, Spain. And then after that, I was invited to look at lithium mining in Portugal, which is where I am now, and have recently had a report and co-authored article come out about that. So boom, big mouthful. Been really dedicating my life to kind of land struggles and people trying to, stop extraction.
So in that last answer, you kind of touched on what I was going to bring up as the next question. Basically, governments, NGOs, and industries are promoting a renewable energy transition using wind farms, geothermal sources, hydroelectric energy production, sometimes lumped in there is nuclear power as well. And a lot of your work argues basically there's no such thing as renewable energy, only what you term fossil fuel plus technologies. Could you kind of lay out this argument and give some more examples?
Yeah, no, I'd love to. I mean, in general, I would actually conceptualize a lot of my work as trying to prepare environmental movements for the kind of the violent repression that is coming for them. And that's why, kind of following Christian Williams and other people, I really applied the lens of counterinsurgency to kind of rural and extractive conflicts. But a part of this is also this kind of label of greening and renewability and clean energy like you're talking about. And like I said already, it was Zapotec and Akup people that actually showed me the serious detrimental reality that also is included in kind of low carbon infrastructural development. And when I came back from there, I was, talking to different environmentalists and climate justice groups saying like, hey, everyone wants to say, oh, fossil fuels, that's the bad guy. We will have the green, and it's you can see it in the marketing everywhere. And this comes from pretty much the 1973 oil crisis, where instead of actually talking about an energy crisis, they started talking about an energy transition there. And that's kind of where this whole kind of ethos and idea comes from. And yeah, but you're watching environmental movements really stress this. And a lot of this comes from the very real suppression by hydrocarbon companies for a long time, trying to ignore how to actually transition away from this. And there's the classic case of Jimmy Carter. He put some solar panels on the White House, and then Reagan came in and took them down. And we have the endless amount of information now of ExxonMobil and all these other companies suppressing something they've known well since the 1970s, right? And that's the thing. A lot of these companies did suppress this up until the 90s, or at least late 90s and early 2000s. But many of them slowly switched over and said, no, this is great. We need to actually start diversifying this, decarbonizing, and participating with all these kind of different environmental regulations. But so this kind of changed their strategy to kind of embrace and to manage this and to ultimately diversify their product and to create new kind of companies. And RWE, for example, who did the Hambach coal mine and is just responsible for consuming the Lutzerat village, they have their own wind energy company. And it's not just wind, it's other low carbon infrastructures that they parade about. And there's actually a big issue of mining companies. I mean, right now it's a huge trend to decarbonize mining companies so they can call themselves green, sustainable, and so on and so forth. But kind of going back to the original story back in 2015, 2016, when I started talking to a lot of environmental movements, they just wanted to talk about fossil fuels. I said, no, it's bigger than this. It's in the webs of oppression and the kind of energy production even are far more complex in terms of that. You can't just actually say fossil fuels were going to replace this renewables, because one, I don't even really think it's renewable. Just even the impact on the ground that I witnessed in Mexico, but like, where are all these metals coming from? Where are all this steel and things like this? And, for years I was ignored or just kind of whatever. Okay. And I'm like, no, but this is serious. Literally we have to think about this. And that's kind of, I think it was when I came back from Peru, it kind of dawned on me after I was kind of verbally assaulted from a climate justice activist. They called me really depressed and mean and bad news and said whatever they could, even though I just came from a mining company making really indirect threats at me and really kind of disturbing kind of interviews of state violence. But it was at that moment I was like, okay, you know what? I think the way to communicate this to environmental justice activists is to say low carbon infrastructures are so-called renewable energy. It is fossil fuel plus. So they can actually understand the problem that it represents. And they're fossil fuels for the sense that the entire supply chain and supply web of wind turbines, solar, hydroelectric dams, they all operate on hydrocarbons and fossil fuels. And that's from how you produce the machines to do the mining, how they're having the machines running on diesel and different things like this to do the mining, even though companies are now trying to electrify that, which is a whole nother can of worms there of more extraction to make electric batteries and find lithium to now mine with electrified mining trucks and underground mine equipment. But no matter how you go on, the chemical industries to actually, how do you make chemical industries? How do you produce these chemicals? And then they're leaching them into the different resources. And, it goes on towards manufacturing, transportation, and also operation. Wind turbines need to be lubricated, and it's been recorded in Oaxaca by me and many other researchers. I've witnessed it, and you can actually look at any, especially older wind turbines, you'll see what looks like dust, but it's actually oil splattering and leaking. It's not to really emphasize that. It's much lower compared to a lot of the systemic kind of destruction. But really, one has to really think about the level of extraction that goes on with this. And I mean, and that's the thing, just even one ton of aluminum to produce this, you need 4 tons of bauxite ore. So that means you're going to be generating 4 tons of waste. For 1 ton of copper, you're going to be generating 110 tons of waste. And then when you get into rare earth elements, which are creating radioactive nuclei, it creates 1.4 tons of radioactive waste, 60 million liters of, waste gas with hydrochloric acid. and it's then using it, and then creates 200,000 liters of acid-containing sewage. It's really severe, and a lot of this comes from Mining Watch, London Mining Watch. Some of these numbers, but I verified them with other kind of studies. But there's still even knowledge gaps, and even these numbers reduce a lot of things. And I can go on. I can bore you with the horror of like how much coal is used. And, choke coal is instrumental for kind of steel mining and things like, or for steel, for melting the steel. And this is a big deal. And right now in Scandinavia, they're trying to use hydroelectric dams, but they're still reliant on this coal, even though they're trying not to be. But this kind of is kind of the idea of Fossil Fuel Plus is just to really communicate to environmental activists and people that, you can't separate these energy systems. There's no such thing as this fossil fuels bad, renewable energy good. They're all tied up in a similar supply chain. They're all tied up with similar capitalist imperatives of growth and profit maximization. And really, yeah, it's a huge issue. And that's not even getting to the kind of the plus part, where at the time I tried to pitch, the plus is a positive way of extracting kinetic energy from the wind. But even that plus, I think there are real possibilities with low carbon infrastructures, but certainly not in terms of how they're powering capitalist society, not in terms of how they're powering constant expansion in mining and really these infrastructures that are extremely energy inefficient and really not with the best interest of people in mind, which is a nice way to say it, So, yeah, Fossil Fuel Plus is a way to say that there's no such thing as the renewable energy and Fossil Fuel Plus, or renewable energy versus fossil fuels. And that Fossil Fuel Plus as a concept is really to stress to environmentalists that this struggle is bigger than just saying no to fossil fuels. But there's so much more to say in terms of the reality of actually the placement of kind of wind turbines. Wind turbines, yeah, it's a long story and I'm kind of jammering on a lot, but just really think about.
No, please, please go. Talk about like where they're put. Talk about the changes in temperatures, or like and drying out of soil, or impacts on birds, or like water displacement. Definitely go into that, please.
Yeah. No, I'd love to. I think in Oaxaca is really good case to kind of look at, because it's a place it's an area where birds are migrating. It's the narrowest point between the Pacific and the Gulf of Mexico. There's a mountain range there that generates very strong winds, and there's also Zapotec, Akut, people who live in the kind of the coastal isthmus region, among others. And the thing is, and there's a lot of fresh water in that area. And so ultimately there became a wind rush in that area. Back in 2000, after a report that was sponsored by USAID, generated a wind rush in that area. And some of it was embraced, some of it contested, especially in the northern part. But as soon as it started going towards the more fishing and kind of lagoon and kind of ocean groups, they were like, no, we didn't see the benefit sharing come in. It was uneven. Things were not what the marketing said. We are seeing impacts to the land. There's no way we're letting you get near the ocean and the lagoon. And so this generated insurrectionary upheaval in 2011, 12, and until 2016. And the struggle continues. But really, people have to remember, because of the romantics and the marketing behind these things, we got to remember just really common sense little kid stuff is when we look at these giant apparatuses of wind turbines or fields of solar panels, is that production to create those robots or that shiny steel comes from somewhere. But for example, the concrete foundations, and again, a lot of it, really the harms of wind turbines and any of these technologies come from, the quantity that you're placing in the area, how you're placing them in the area. So the movement, how much, and then it depends on the geography of what's there, what type of animals, and different things like this. And I'm forgetting another aspect of it, but there are ways that you can use low carbon infrastructures in a responsible way, but the scale, I think that's the other aspect, how big they are, where they're placed, and how many are placed there are going to be crucial in terms of how bad they're going to affect the ecology, the animals, and the people that live there. And so depending on geography, there's 7, I guess I'll speak in feet, but, ultimately the foundations are 32 to 45 feet deep, depending on where they're placed. And they're also 52 to 68 feet wide in diameter. And so that means that that's being filled with concrete and reinforced steel, about 93% concrete and the rest steel. which, with rebar and anyone who's seen construction or concrete. But in the Barra de Santa Teresa, we confirmed that they had enormous foundations that were going in between, I believe it was between 19 and 48 meters. They'd have to drill down if they wanted to, because it's surrounded by salt water, had fresh water in the middle, and with sand with vegetation. And we talked to the people who were drilling. And the other thing was they were drilling to look at wind turbine stuff, but they were also looking for natural gas and other resources to mine, just to stress again the connection between extractive industries. But so the concrete foundations are enormous. The amount of steel that you need per megawatt is somewhere between 107 and 132 tons. The glass carbon composites, which you can't recycle. There's some Bloomberg article about how they're just dumping them in landfills. And again, the wind turbines only live between 25 and 35 years. With retrofitting parts, you can extend their life to 45 years. And then really their lifespan's a big issue of how companies are taking advantage of small towns where, people want to make it big, develop, make new schools. Politicians are trying to pack their pockets with money, but they're not actually negotiating decommissioning. So a lot of those costs get dropped on this city that can't afford it. They didn't negotiate for it, and they spent the money by the time after 35, 45 years, So that's another big issue. But aluminum, depending on the model, it's between 500 to 1,600 tons per gigawatt. Copper, like I said, the median is 2.1 tons, or it could be up to 5 tons per megawatt of copper. Dysprosium, so a type of rare earth. There's different kind of hybrid and direct drive turbines, but no matter what, every wind turbine is going to have some aspects of rare earth metals in it, which is important, whether it's for the connections to hold up the towers or for the resins that they're making it so that they're spicing the metals of the towers with rare earth so that they don't rust as much. And usually the wind turbines at sea are actually going to be the direct drive turbines that are going to have per gigawatt 17 tons of rare earth metals, which is insane. And right now, for example, in Europe, 95% of that is coming from China, or at least from a couple years ago, 95% of that's coming from China. I can really, another huge issue in connecting different struggles is actually balsa wood for the blade composites, which is relating to deforestation in the Amazon. And Larry Lohman has been great at kind of calling this out and working with people down in Ecuador on this. But I can go on for hours with this, but I think there's this mineral composition, which I already kind of spoke about before. The turbines, if you have fresh water in there, they're going to have to pump it out. They're going to have to put chemicals in it to stabilize and create the foundations. And before you can even go in there, you need to do habitat clearance, to be able to to make roads. And if there's roads that exist, you're going to have to widen and compact them. If there's roads that don't exist, you're going to have to make them. But either way, you're compacting and widening the soil to bring in heavy machinery. Then you're digging big foundations, you're pouring concrete in them. All of this has severe socio-ecological impacts. The ecological is clear. It is actually going to prevent the drainage and is going to create flooding in those areas. In addition to having wind turbines that are going to be, if there is wind, they're going to be kind of putting it into the ground. It's going to be dispersing the wind in that area. And so if you're a Zapotec farmer who deeply values his culture, the land, the production of tortillas without using machines, and you want to resist these projects and your neighbors are selling out, you're going to be having wind turbines near you, watching them drip oil and have your cows eat it, and also into your water wells, and then experiencing extreme drying and extreme flooding in these areas depending on the season. And what's really interesting in the case of Oaxaca and this area in the isthmus is that there's roughly 2,000 or more wind turbines in the area. This is now, some people are saying, and this I guess you can say is conjecture, but there's been severe drought, but now there's a lack of fresh water draining into the Lagoon Superior, which is now changing salinity in the area where people are fishing. So, yeah, and this is in addition to the typical stuff people should know about in terms of how many birds they kill, and things like this. But really, and then there's the political violence and kind of the social aspect. This is actually changing and preventing people from subsisting. And that's why the book Renewing Destruction, which came out of this work in Oaxaca, not the conclusion, but the last chapter is actually looking at how really wind energy development is continuing a process of genocide and ecocide in this area to break people's means of subsistence, to kind of force them into the dominant culture and enter migration routes within Mexico to go be kind of an urban landless worker. And then, as we know, also go up to the United States for kind of better opportunity. So they're having a displacing effect, preventing people from subsisting, degrading the ecology to force people into these migration routes. But yeah, sorry, that's a big windfall. I mean, maybe you should ask me some more questions from that, because I can go on all day with some of the kind of the harms. And I've worked in many sites and seen these in France and Mexico and things like this.
No, I think, I think that's super helpful. And I'm glad that you could lay that out. And I think that the important thing is not to like, I don't want you to necessarily break down more sort of like technologies and the problems with them, because I think that you just sort of like expanding on what the problems are with this one specific one and the sort of questions of like, what are we not talking about in terms of this? You can apply that same approach towards any of the other so-called alternative sources of renewable or low carbon or whatever energies. That framework is what is lacking, I think, in like a critical approach towards this. The only other question I would ask in relation to that specifically is, I don't think you addressed where the energy is going. Like, is it actually going back into the communities where this infrastructure is being built? Like, are they suddenly getting electricity where they didn't before? Like, is a hospital getting it?
This is capitalism. Of course not. I mean, and I guess the typical thing that I tell people is, to conceive of low carbon infrastructural development, there's kind of 4 phases. There's the raw material extraction. Actually, there's 5. There's raw material extraction, land contracting. So the things I talked about, the mining and supply chains, land contracting. How is this land even accessible? How are the companies getting it? Are they making nice contract deals? Are they unequal? Are they engaging in blatantly racist practices and using language to kind of get better contracts? Or do they have pistoleros or gunmen going there and intimidating people? So how is the land contracted? Third is the immediate kind of ecological, social, and economic impacts from the operation of these things and where they are. Fourth is the energy use, and this is the real green deal breaker, in the sense of, man, this isn't for encouraging low consumption, becoming responsible for our energy use and taking back our power, you could say. This is for transnational capital, large industries. And in the case of Oaxaca, which is a particularly illuminating one, is that, so there's 2,000 wind turbines. Most of it is owned and energy propelling. Walmart is a huge player and one of the biggest employers in Mexico. And they've got they're doing everything they can to say that, Walmart is on clean and green energy. And it's because they're getting it from this area. So the energy is being exported. The big concrete companies, industrial construction companies, Cemex, they've got shares in these wind parks and are powering these things. There's 2, Grupo Mexico, like I mentioned, but also Penoles. Between the 2 of them, they have 3 wind parks of approximately 30 wind turbines that are powering their operation. I can't tell if it goes directly to mines or if it's just their office buildings. But like, this is serious. You have wind companies you have wind turbines powering more mining. And yeah, you got Heineken. Actually, they were actually on the project that people rose up and fought and won, but they moved that to a different area. But Grupo Bimbo, so junk fast food, like low quality Twinkie style foods and white bread. Yeah, you name it. Ultimately, it's big companies, and this is serious. And I guess the 5th side is decommissioning. Is like, where do these go after 35, 40 years? And there's serious problems with actually the recyclability and how this is being used. And like I mentioned with the carbon composites, they're just putting them in landfills. Recycling for rare earth minerals is very low at this point, even though they're highly valuable and extremely mineral energy and material intensive, and material in the sense of how much ore and toxic waste that's produced from, for getting a certain amount. But it's really severe. And it's not just Oaxaca that does this. In France or the other places I've worked, these aren't for powering those areas. Usually those areas in rural places are rather self-sufficient on what already exists. It's usually going and exporting to large kind of consumer industrial areas or cities, And yeah, a lot of the energy from Oaxaca was going to Guatemala, Belize, and also I read it in 2009 in the USAID report was also to California. And the same goes in France, in the area where people were fighting the transformer and the other wind projects in the area. It was to go to Toulouse and Montpellier and those cities like this. So it's a lot of this is, really raises the question of like how to compost and transform cities and to really maybe get serious about degrowth initiatives in those places.
Yeah. So, I mean, since you just said it, A buzzword in the academic world of ecological studies these days is just that, it's degrowth. To me, this kind of feels like it's got the seeds of a course of action against colonial capitalist drive that does such violence that you've been describing on the world and its inhabitants. And it's so focused on extraction, processing, concentration of wealth and concentration of poison and poverty, and just constant expansion, right? Can you talk a little bit about degrowth? Like what the term is, the term and the framing useful in your view, and what can it offer, and if it's being applied well or misapplied currently?
Yeah, no, I'd love to. I mean, in one sense, if I wasn't dedicating a lot of my time in academia, I'm not sure how relevant degrowth would be for me if I was already someone who was on the ground struggle, already very clearly being capitalism can't expand. We have to protect this forest. We have to stop these mines. We have to stop these pipelines. In that sense, you're already there. You're already in struggle. You already know that this has to stop. But if you are in academia, and if you are someone circulating around universities, and if you are trying to organize to really, I think, make a more policy-oriented change, then degrowth is actually rather important in terms of it being a broad front that is saying we need to reduce material and energy use, or throughput, as they say. But it's really openly saying that we can't keep growing. We need to actually challenge the myth of green growth and eco-modernism, and to really get serious about ecological and social and climate crisis, and to stop this and really try to transform this. And obviously there's a lot of heat and attacks against degrowth. Oh, you just want economic crisis. You want to destroy society and all this. And it's no, degrowth is intended to be a planned and kind of safe and equitable reduction of material and energy throughput. It is a precaution measure to stop and to begin addressing, not only just the ecological and climate crisis and kind of the extractive realities behind capitalism, but also the kind of the racism, sexism, and I think to a lesser degree, I'm not sure how much they actually engage with kind of queer research and things like this. But there is this real concerted effort to figure out how to localize, how to actually, really close the sites of production and consumption, to eliminate line loss and more high tension power lines. And so in this sense, degrowth is super important, and it's a much bigger and highly popular phenomenon in Europe. And a lot of it's because a lot of people know things are messed up. I mean, if you just look out the window and you really look how everything is being constructed, where do these materials come from? Why are all the trees kind of around concrete enclosures? Why do we all live in enclosures in this certain way that all look oddly like hospitals and or nicer versions of prisons or weird suburban model villages? Then there's something wrong. And in Europe, this has been big and has really attracted a lot of students. And degrowth really comes from ecological economics in terms of really challenging economic growth, and to being a more honest economics. That said, is there such thing as an honest economics that sits in their chairs and makes these models and thinks they can kind of control the world through different kind of reductive categories? I remain highly suspicious, to put it nicely. And I think this leads to some of the problems with degrowth, is because it's very kind of policy oriented and comes from kind of ecological economics. It tends to, I think, be rather disconnected from on the ground struggles, specifically from anarchists or autonomists and different kind of indigenous fighters. And I mean, maybe that's the thing, because I think where degrowth comes from in a more kind of recent history is it comes out of the anti-globalization movement. And on one side, you have, degrowth was kind of back to the land, self-sufficiency, kind of eco-construction, bike critical mass. And it was these kind of prefigurative practices, which are very important. But at the same time, as anyone who was maybe around at that time, there tended to, obviously there's overlap amongst some people, but there tended to be this kind of, I don't know how to say this nicely, but there tended to be this kind of prefigurative, oh, we can be happy, friendly. But then the other side, there's a lot of people, and I think rightfully so, they're like, we're here to crash this meeting and we are here to destroy as much and cause as much economic damage as we can to these companies, and to really say that, to protest that this, the World Trade Organization, IMF, you name it, these things are not okay. So there's maybe always been this kind of combative practice divide from this kind of prefigurative divide. And I think it's very important to put them together. And and then obviously I'm referencing kind of black bloc tactics in the anti-globalization movement. It seems like they're the ones that kind of combined it, even though in those sites of protests would go for it. But so, yeah, I think this divide that you can maybe see for people that are, and rightfully and understandable, or not rightfully necessarily, but at least understandably kind of, scared of combative practice, there's always been a little bit of a divide, one that I've never really felt comfortable with. But I feel like this kind of reproduces itself within degrowth, especially in the way that, for example, how the Humbach forest struggle, or the No Model de Tensión Lina struggle, so the no high tension power line struggle in Catalonia, or even the ZAD struggle, to at least in its earlier days, have been ignored in degrowth. And actually, and my contention is to really stress the importance of really recognizing the D in degrowth, and that is to recognize that the destructive capacities are actually really important of forest defense, anti-pipeline mining, and things like this. These are really important components that are crucial. And I think this maybe goes back, and since we're kind of on this radio station, I think this goes back to an anarchist contention maybe, where it's like, that's great, your prefigurative struggle is good, these are nice, but, meanwhile this system consumes, expands, and is kind of destroying everything around us. So really it might make more sense to stop this capacity of the system reproducing itself and taking more. That will actually be contributing greatly to the reduction of kind of destruction, and also the expansion of kind of energy and material use. So, yeah, I think this is the thing. And I just to maybe kind of summarize it, since I think I'm getting kind of off track a bit, is to say that there's great things in degrowth. It is actually trying to address serious problems of capitalism that I think are difficult to really go at and to challenge it. And it's doing that. And there's a lot of popularity. There's a lot going behind it. But it can definitely improve on actually supporting people who are in prison, people who are on the front lines, really, and not just like front lines, NGO talking about, quote, frontliners, but people who are really in permanent conflict and trying to stop the spread of this thing in a real way. And I think there's ways that degrowth can deeply improve on actually supporting and acknowledging struggles like the No Tab movement in Italy, the Zona de Fons, the Humbach Forest, and so many others, instead of referencing the same kind of struggles. And I guess I've identified that, combative action is more acceptable outside Europe than actually acknowledging where it is, even in your own backyard, which is, I guess this is maybe kind of common of academia. But yeah, there can be improvement there. And I really hope that since a lot of degrowth people are trying to engage in policy, that they will work to make space for combative land defenders, that they will fight terrorism trumped up charges and actually be able to restore people's right to resist without facing horrible stuff that's like horrible trumped up charges. And really, I guess my position is to really everyone where they are to do what they can to create more unmediated space so people can actually begin to literally take back their power and energy generation, learn how to defend themselves, learn how to care for each other, learn how to engage in forest gardening. And really just what can we do to improve our relationships? What can we do to and amongst each other, but also with animals and trees? How can we improve forest quality, water quality, and so on? And I think this is the game. And how can we do this in an anti-authoritarian way is the goal that we should be trying to get to from our different positions, capabilities, and desires. Go!
If you would like to support The Final Straw, you can subscribe to our podcast via various platforms, follow and share our materials online, as well as give us feedback via the links at tfsr.wtf/tree, as in Linktree. To support our transcription work and wider project, you can subscribe to us via patreon.com/tfsr. You can also buy some merch or find donation methods at tfsr.wtf/support.
The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
It's going down, and you're invited for what they selling. We ain't buying. There is no running. There is no hiding. There's only fighting or dying. It's going down, and you're invited for what they selling. We ain't buying. There is no running. There is no hiding. There's only fighting or dying.
It's Going Down is a digital community center from anarchist, anti-fascist, autonomous, anti-capitalist, and anti-colonial movements. Our mission is to provide an autonomous and resilient platform to publicize and promote revolutionary theory and action.
Go to itsgoingdown.org for daily updates. Check out our online store for ways to donate, and rate and follow us on iTunes if you like this podcast.
So I guess I want to talk a little bit more about what that resistance has looked like and sort of your impressions on it. But while we're on the topic of degrowth, in 2019, there was a film that covered a lot of similar critiques of renewable energy. It's called The Planet of the Humans. I think Michael Moore was one of the producers of it. And it definitely stirred some pots. It was not only a focus on questions about the reality of renewable energy, the inputs, how do you sunset these technologies, how do you clean up what's left behind by them. But the film focused a lot on the population bomb theory, this sort of like neo-Malthusian book that came out in the 1970s that was basically claiming that the main reason that we're having ecological crisis, along with all these social crises, is because there's too many people. That approach really ignores the varieties and ways that peoples live in their environments, as well as different levels of technology, energy consumption, and waste that different kinds of people engage. And this is a thing that I think that for some people hearing the term degrowth, they're going to think, like we need to cut back on population because more people means more waste means. And what if the rest of the former third world each gets a car or whatever? I kind of wonder if you could take a moment to sort of approach this question and the Eurocentric and ableist and colonial like mindset that some people approach the idea of degrowth from.
Yeah, no, I got you. I'm familiar with that film. In fact, I wrote, I think in Mexico and in the Houston Chronicle op-eds about it with a co-author, and also a longer version on the Undisciplined Environments blog, which is a great resource. But so I guess starting with the positive, there's 2 points in that film, and I think you covered the negatives very well, but I'll get back, I'll speak to some of those. The 2 things that we got to give love to that film on is, they're raising important issues about low carbon infrastructures. 1, I think they could have done it better. I think the format of how they presented it could have been improved. A lot of the numbers and studies, for some reason, it's all very old from like 2013, even though it came out in 2019. But hey, they're raising a good point there. Also, another painfully important point is the problem and role of NGOs and large environmental NGOs and how they're kind of pacifying movements and selling out movements. Good job. Great points. I might say on that second point, I think submedia.tv maybe did a better job with the NCIV film with their segment on Green is the Color of Money. But yeah, it's really hard to take those aspects seriously when they're using old data. And then, of course, the way that they're kind of emphasizing, they don't emphasize it, but it's there. And it's there clear in terms of what they're saying. But I think for people to remember is no matter what, consumption is always the bigger problem. Consumption is going to really dictate how much is being destroyed. And I guess the easy statistic that's it's something approximately along the lines of 1 person from the US is 15 people in the global south in terms of material footprint, or maybe it's even 24 or something like this. And 1 person from France is 8 down in somewhere in the global south. There's always a problem with statistics and the numbers and things like this. But the idea is that, man, really, if we want to degrow in the global north for sure. And that's a big debate in degrowth in terms of don't tell us how to live down here. You're reproducing colonial dynamics within degrowth by doing this. And I'll say more to that, but to really stick to this population thing, the population question is always such a huge problem. And I think one important way to remember it and to think about it was what Michel Foucault said in History of Sexuality was, the political economy of population. And it's to remember really that states are they more or less organize and try to construct, rampant populations so people could actually become the wealth of nations. They are the power. They are the energy to work in industry and go to war, of which Emma Goldman and many other anarcho and socialist feminists have called out actually the way that they are being turned into factories for kind of capitalist production. And so, but really this kind of creation of population as a problem, we have to look back to the state. We have to look back to how people are being, people and also ecosystems are treated as resources, as labor, as timber, or some type of fodder for war. And then on top of this, the next issue is that usually when the population question comes up, it is more or less coded to always be looking to the global south, always be looking to pretty much pass off some kind of racist agenda in some ways. And maybe there might be genuine concerns about this for people, but it's like locked into a discourse that is like tied up with sterilizing Black and indigenous people in the United States. It's tied up with fascistic kind of ideas. And it's super concerning. And so whenever the population question comes up, there really needs to be work done and critical reflection that this isn't just ultimately some kind of racist ploy, which I think you're getting at. But maybe to bring it back to the kind of the degrowth topic, and yeah, that film was horrible like this. And it also really didn't show the ardent resistance from people, especially in Latin America and Africa and Southeast Asia, who are fighting all these different kind of low carbon infrastructure projects. And like I keep mentioning, we're the first to actually raise the red flags about them. But in terms of degrowth, what's actually very funny is you have different Latin American scholars saying, this is colonial. We need to grow in the global south or in Latin America. And you degrow up there. But I think and I'm thinking of Arturo Escobar, who's been, I think, rather clear on this topic. He's like, no, we don't need, I believe it was in a Case for Degrowth book launch, but he was very clear. He's like, we don't need more middle-class gated communities in Latin America or anywhere. This reproduction of colonial and high energy and material intensive lifestyles is not good for the planet or people themselves, and I would suggest, especially in line with kind of social war theory, the rich aren't doing themselves favors by living in this weird kind of psychosis of gated communities and insecurity and protecting what they have. And just look at the rates of pharmaceuticals, suicides, and but that's a whole nother topic. But I think it's important to understand. I think in matters of degrowth, it's kind of questionable, some of its roots and kind of economics and policy that needs to be looked at very carefully. And I guess from the global north, but I think it shouldn't be used. Those aspects shouldn't be used to actually critically reflect on really abhorrent and disgusting energy-intensive infrastructures that are not creating good social spaces and are creating weird exclusions, really exacerbating different class and kind of racist kind of operations that are being lived in Peru or wherever in Latin America. So in this sense, I think this is, again, one of the big values in degrowth is to actually really say like, hey, we got to get serious about this and really question how we're living and change this.
So you use the term socio-ecological, and I kind of read that as being not only the environment that lives around us, but also our living inside of it. Is that like a fair way?
Yeah, it's to really stress that we can't talk about the ecological without talking about the social.
Okay.
And that's more or less to say, you can't talk about the ecological without talking about colonialism or racism or even class issues in terms of how these are all deeply interconnected. And it's my attempt to not separate these things by saying socio-ecological.
That makes sense. So the narrative of what you might call socio-ecological resistance is often framed around climate marches, lobbying, summits, and Earth Days. I know that there's been radical resistance on Turtle Island to Ecocide from Capital State and settler goons, and this goes back to the first white feet that set down on this continent. But it feels like there's been a ramping up in the last decade of participation in radical resistance here, from resistance to pipelines crossing the lands of Standing Rock Sioux and Wet'suwet'en peoples, to the solidarity of shutting down settler infrastructure, to the growing practice of land occupations like Weelaunee in South Atlanta. And the scope appears to also be actively linking to other struggles like Zods and Notav and Hambach and more recently Lutzerat. In some ways, it reminds me of what I've read about the heady days of the anti-roads movement in the UK, or the rise of the second generation of Earth First in the so-called US. Could you talk a bit about the resistance that you've been seeing and how you see your work complementing the resisting of damaging infrastructure projects?
Yeah, I'd love to. Kind of like what I said is that I guess a lot of this is a bit of like an ethical position in terms of being an academic. I don't think we don't need more graduate or PhD students, going and trying to investigate the resistance and, what is it to be resisting? And I think this really is just a symptom of people who aren't already resisting themselves, who are kind of viewing these conflicts from inside a house, looking out the window and are curious about it, but don't place themselves really within that conflict a lot of ways. And I think that, I think it's important for academics and you can be in these conflicts while you're researching them, but I think it's really important to place the gaze on the companies and the things that are hidden, to really show what the different kind of elites, government administrations or companies, what they're trying to hide, what they're trying to ignore, and really, ultimately the bad deals they're trying to form to try to get people to engineer kind of deals so people sell out their environment, so they sell out their water for a certain amount of money, which they think is a lot of money, but in 5 years they don't have any of that, when before they always had their subsistence and clean water. So I think it's really important to investigate what people are trying not to investigate and to really research that. And there's one of the things is there are really good critical works in academia that are having deep discussions about this. But for me, that's what's really important. And what I try to do is I really try to give case studies for people to understand how companies are operating in environmental conflicts. And this is why I've taken on the lens of counterinsurgency. And it's rather basic. And it was back in Portland with Christian Williams. He was the one who, for me, I looked at him and I was like, wow, you're really taking this serious. You're really looking at the tactics and strategies of the police and how they're operating. And I really like this. And there's many people who followed his work. I think Tom Nomad, who speaks on here, has also done great work on this. And so for me, I was really applying this lens to environmental conflicts, to really understand what is going on. And it was rather productive. And I think it really helps you in academia to cut to the point. And I've kind of coined the term, the political ecology of counterinsurgency, kind of as a study to talk about these things. But it's really trying to look at, how are people being pacified, and it's really asking this question, given all the talk about climate change and environmental disaster and climate youth marches, then how come these mines are still opening? How come it's progressing? How come there's still pipelines? How come people are still either actively or passively submitting to these things? And the people who are resisting, what's happening to them? So the lens of counterinsurgency is very logical. Security budgets are, marketing and security budgets are some of the largest in companies in terms of public funds. They absorb tons of public, at least on the so-called security side. So meaning policing, military, and often private security / paramilitary sources. And again, the line between paramilitaries and police, is always pretty funny in terms of, what distinguishes that, or so-called professionalism. But, what is actually undermining these people's ability to protect their land, to protect what gives them life, to protect their social fabrics, and follow the money. So let the lens of counterinsurgency I've always found rather useful in terms of actually, cross-checking them with military and police manuals to be like, oh, they're doing all these psychological operations that are associated with marketing and public relations. They're applying all these same techniques that they're also talking about military manuals as psyops. And it's very interesting actually how marketing agencies and the military are actually circulating and trading knowledge about these things. But you can see how this works. And for me, the main goal of my work, or at least this strand of my work, has been to really do everything I can to really show and provide tools for environmental activists and people who are concerned about defending the animals, trees, and stopping the manufacturing of different infrastructures that are going to destroy and poison what really gives us life. And this is the thing, is that we live on a planet. So I think the nuclear disasters are really clear at showing this, is that everything happens on this planet is connected. If there's a nuclear disaster in Fukushima, if you're on the west coast of the United States or elsewhere, you know that you had radioactive nuclei particles coming across the sea and air, and people talking about taking iodine pamphlets. are iodine pills. And same with even when the nuclear testing and how those clouds in the Nevada desert and elsewhere, and how, the U.S. military was testing nuclear weapons on their soldiers, but how that shifts. But same comes to the issue of low carbon infrastructures. And so right now, a really big thing, I'm maybe getting off a topic a little bit, but a big thing right now is carbon accounting and actually how measurements are bounded. And so what this means is that literally people are rolling out electric vehicles right now, trying to be green, feel good, still be consumers, get good gas mileage, use less petrol. But ultimately it's exporting, and this is done through accounting. They're exporting all the crazy extractive supply chains I talked about earlier to the global south, which is now based, because they're not actually accounting the supply chains that literally at the border, they stop the accounting. So literally the supply chains of these companies, and what's interesting about them, according to some 2017 sustainable supply chain textbook, besides the first sentence saying there's no such thing as a sustainable supply chain, a lot of companies are only claiming 14% of their supply chains because they're subcontracting these things. So when it comes to climate accounting and carbon footprint, they're not actually looking what's happening outside these borders. So for example, Norway can talk about how they reduced emissions in the city. They're doing so good. Everyone's electric and rich. Yeah, social democracy. And they're doing great. But the reality is they're generating demand for insane mines, for insane chemical processes, and really promoting ecocide through electrification and decarbonization. And this isn't represented, which then ultimately this is going to be racist on some level. This is going to crush into this in terms of how literally the global south is being shamed for being ecologically destructive and falling low on the metrics, when they're really just producing what's demand and what global supply chains and colonialism has organized for the last century or two. So yeah, there's a lot of really, really serious issues about all this, but I'm getting off track. So I guess the main point is just to stress that a lot of my work is really to try to really show and to get into what's really going on and to really support people who are engaged in land defense and struggle to be able to see what's going on and how it's working so they can make, as a great liberal academic, they can make better and more informed choices about how they do it. And that means for me to be teaching and showing the things that are often excluded from kind of teaching curriculums in terms of repressive violence, and also the struggles and what people are doing in those areas. And I guess that relates to what I'm hoping the study of degrowth will do in terms of like really recognizing and including the places that are fighting and where people are putting their life on the line to really keep the trees and keep their waters clean and really improve the social relationships and break down barriers between people.
Yeah, I think that's super important. I don't think that's off track at all. Like, I think that the point of the exporting and invisibilizing of violence as a part of the nature of our economy, the nature of our technology. I mean, it's the sort of like ones who walked away from Omela, moment where like referencing that Ursula Le Guin short story about this like beautiful city where everything is balanced, everything is beautiful, everyone's healthy, everyone's happy. And at a certain age, everyone is like, every child is brought into this room where they witness like someone who is by the standards of the society mangled and tortured and like left in this room alone and miserable. And, the sort of work that you and other folks that you've named, like Christian Williams, are doing, or Peter Gelderloos, is to pull back that curtain and say like, well, cool, like it looks good for you over here, but what about those like, when Elon Musk tweets that like we'll coup whoever we want, like because we want that lithium at an affordable price or whatever, or that's the mask coming off. That is actually how the world under capitalism operates. So I think that work is super important, and I'm really glad to be talking to you for that. I think another element of, and I'm not going to say like less important in any way, but another element of the exportation of violence, or like when you put into the calculations how this extraction relies on enforcement, and enforcing Ecocide is one collection that you and Andrea Brock, who you mentioned before, collaborated on. And this also kind of reminds me of like the work of Don Paley as well, but is to talk about the actual material cost of that if you were to do like a fuller accounting of the cost of, oil being like rare earth minerals coming out of the Democratic Republic of Congo, or copper coming out of Peru or what have you, or Chile, might be a measure of like what's the actual cost of enforcing protection of these areas, how much energy goes into a tank or an like a armored personnel carrier, or the sidearms that those like narcos or mercs are carrying in this area to make sure that indigenous people get chased out of their home so that extraction can happen. There's a couple of land occupation and defense projects that are on Turtle Island that we featured on the show, that have been trying to focus on the intersection of ecological devastation at the local level, as well as be in solidarity with people facing repression elsewhere. The two that I'm thinking of are Cop City and Camp Grayling, which is blocking a National Guard training facility in Michigan. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about like that confluence a little bit more.
Yeah, no, I'd love to. And I'd also like to take the time to just to give a shout out to Don Pele. I think they do marvelous work, especially the drug war capitalism theory. She's doing great journalistic work and is a great researcher in general. But so yeah, glad you mentioned her. And but yeah, really, so this edited volume, Enforcing Ecocide, that I did with Andrea Brock was Andrea and I have both worked for a while in environmental conflicts and have done a lot to apply the lens of counterinsurgency to really understand the kind of, the techniques of repression and how ultimately the police are a key mechanism to really enforcing ecocide. But I think since we focus on this, but it goes much further than that, and I think it was really when I was watching in Asheville, North Carolina, I believe it was during the George Floyd protests, where ultimately the police had done a preemptive raid on kind of like a support center with bottles of water and likely stuff to wash tear gas out of people's eyes and things like this, but very, very caring, useful kind of logistical tent to kind of support people who are going to be brutalized by police. They raided the place with riot police, surrounded it, and you just see this video of them slashing water bottles and pouring fresh water into the gutter and generating heaps of plastic. And it's just like, holy shit. Like, the police are so not helpful and are literally one of the most degrading ecological forces in this world. And so taking that idea, like, let's take that idea seriously. And it's like, well, okay, it's a fact that the military is one of the most resource intensive in every way, shape, or form monsters in this world that not only is requiring a ton of extraction, but then is actively promoting ecocide through dropping napalm, cluster bombs, airstrikes, drones, you name it. So the military and then the enormous Navy ships and that whole logistics it's an ecological catastrophe. It is climate change, and people want to shame people for personal consumption and things like this. It's like, go after the police and military. This is the thing we should really be having a conversation about, or the data centers and the technophilia that's being that really made huge wins with the rise of COVID. And obviously there's convenience associated with that. But really back on the topic and maybe speaking to my chapter in the book is that one of the things I want to argue in there is that literally every social fucking racial conflict or anything like this is always going to be an ecological struggle, because the police couldn't even make the horror that they do, or at least they couldn't do it with the same kind of technological prowess. They couldn't accomplish this job with the numbers that they have if they didn't have the cars, logistics, and machinery and everything that goes into this. And in that chapter, I really try to think about and calculate, like, how many fossil fuels are they using? Like, what type of metals go into these guns? How are they refined? But the main thing is to think that whenever there's a riot against police brutality and their, ultimately the murder, just straight executions that they're performing in the streets, that's also an ecological problem. The police couldn't do that with the ease that they do, and they couldn't manage protests the ways that they do without supply chains and brutal ecological degradation. And so this is really to say that the oppression of people the oppression of humans is deeply implicated in the destruction, contamination, poisoning, and degradation of rivers, trees, and every type of fucking ecosystem there is. Because without the supply chains, without the mining, without these things, you couldn't have this level of police violence and repression. And that kind of leads more to the second part of what you're saying, is really the importance of defending the Atlanta forest and these struggles that are really even further showing the connection between literally counterinsurgency training grounds, urban warfare centers that they're trying to destroy. They're literally trying to go in there and murder trees. They're trying to go in there and poison water and get it hooked on some weird chemicals that's going to poison more people. It's obviously disproportionately targeting people of color. It's because this is what the police do. This is what these infrastructures do. And it's all, and there's a real, domestic urban warfare centers have very serious consequences for everyone in those areas. They are going to be employing murderous counterinsurgency and maybe even worse than murderous. These are techniques designed for torture and management in brutal ways that are going to be applied to the population when people disagree with what governments are doing or disagree with what police departments are doing. And the same with Camp Grayling. Literally to stop the capacity of the military to be killing and to be invading and to be colonizing other countries and places and engaging and reaffirming an imperial project is severely important. And I really hope that more people take an interest in these struggles and are doing what they can, because right now, from what I've seen, is there is an immense repression and now preemptive repression going after literally the community organizing groups going over there using crazy the RICO law legislation. And also, they're executing people who are doing nonviolent tree sits and things like this. So these struggles are so important and so serious and are connecting these issues in so many ways. Like many of the other struggles I've worked in, who are fighting coal mines and also trying to stop other literally every other types of domination the best they can. Obviously, these things aren't perfect. But this includes recognizing the Humbach forest struggle was very good in recognizing the problem of low carbon infrastructures and the problem of wind energy, because the mines were being powered and surrounded by solar panels for public relations and things like this. And I think this, and speaking of Camp Grayling, I think one of the things people need to prepare for is actually how useful low carbon technologies are for the military and also mining companies. The low carbon infrastructures are allowing mining companies to operate in areas in the Arctic and other areas in Australia where they are difficult to get to because there isn't the grid infrastructure. Same with the military. They've been talking about this for some time, and actually how units can actually operate in more kind of distant areas because they will have different power sources and will be able to recharge through low carbon infrastructure. So small solar, or who knows what they're up to. This relates to a coin that I termed, and that's sustainable violence. And this is the way that they're actually trying to, how police forces and military forces are trying to employ low carbon technologies to enact violent practices and really to reaffirm class and kind of racial lines that the state has created. And it's serious. And I'm rambling on, but I just would like to stress the intersection between policing and militarization is deeply implicated with how it's actually destroying ecosystems, and that all these struggles are deeply connected. And the more that people can unify and understand the importance of ecologies for our health and to healing each other and the way that they're being killed, so ultimately people and different class and ethnic interests can be organizing power to oppress certain populations of people, but really going after everyone to facilitate a system of capitalism and just widespread and total extractivism, which really, I think everyone, truly everyone, even the people a part of these upper classes or a part of these police forces, I think everyone has an interest in not being shitty and killing each other and not destroying the ecosystems that give us life. What's the old saying? Don't shit where you eat. It's very simple. And we really, as a species of modern industrial humans, should not be doing this. And we should be working to try to minimize this. And really, it falls on the governments. It falls on these institutions. They're the ones that have been leading and enforcing this path of total destruction, or at least a severe degradation that's rather progressive at this point.
Well, Dr. Alexander, thank you very much for having this conversation. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate your work. That was basically the end of the questions that I had. I wonder if there's any other topics that I didn't ask about that you wanted to speak on here.
No, I mean, I think I just rambled myself out. There's a lot of different areas and things that I've worked in that I'm sure there's always something to say. I guess I just want to give it'd be worth, I guess, as an academic resource or just a resource to learn more about extractivism is the Exalt initiative, the Global Extractivisms and Alternatives to It initiative out of the University of Helsinki. There's tons of really interesting academic debates that are hosted and free online from so many great scholars from so many different struggles and people around the world. That's maybe something useful to give a shout out. And yeah, just really, I appreciate this radio station. I greatly appreciate submedia.tv and really all the land defenders and people that are really stepping up to do what they can to defend the things they care about. And really everyone out there that's doing it what they can to really create space to really thwart off and mitigate an ecological and climatic crisis and a social crisis that's kind of been well in place for some time. And hopefully we can hopefully we can enjoy this. Hopefully we can make the best out of these things and have a good time despite all this. But no, thank you so much. And I love what the Final Straw is doing. So thanks for interviewing me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. There was one other resource that you'd mentioned elsewhere that's like a ecological global justice map. Is that a thing you could name drop?
Yeah. And another great kind of academic resource people worth knowing about is the Environmental Justice Atlas. It's out of Barcelona. It's been around for at least 10 years or more, but it's actually participatory map charting and reveals all of the different types of conflicts around the world. And there's many more to be added in there, but so far it's around 4,000 conflicts it's charted, and it's really good. It's got some limitations, but in terms of getting an overview and seeing a lot of different conflicts out there, it's a highly recommended resource, and greatly appreciate the people who've been putting it together over the years, even if I have my criticisms.
Critical support. Cool. Yeah, thanks a lot. And now some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
This is the list compiled by the Mapping Police Violence Project of those who were killed by police, July 2022. Jada Johnson. Name withheld, July 2nd, Huntington Park, California. Jesus Rodolfo Torres. Michael Moore. Glenn Nisich. James Parks. Brian W. Humble. Miguel Gallarzo. Trayvon Darian Hull. James Lee Spears Howard. Robnesia Waring. Shannon Emile Mayfield. Reginald Humphrey. Matthew Scott Jones. Jerry Lee Esparza. Brett Rosenau. Juan Carlos Bojorquez. Imani Mac Davis. Nathaniel James Gomez. Rafael Esteban Ramirez. Alejandro Molina Corneo. Felipe Guerrero. Jasper Aaron Lynch. Roderick Brooks. Shane Netterville. Raul Hardy. Malik Williams. Jaime Rodriguez. Dylan E. Walker. Mac Lee. Madeline Miller. Terrell Anton Jones. Thomas Cromwell. Mark Evers. Matthew Hyde. Timothy Ostrander. Malachi LeVar Carroll. Curtis Dale Barnett. Robert Vladimir Brown. Romaine Manuel. Gloria Melton. Name withheld, July 13th, Houston, Texas. Michael Stiletto. Maurice Corey McCarthy Hughes. Name withheld, July 14th, Ontario, California. Andrew Techley Sunberg. Paul Chavez Jr., Stephen Balsam, Trent William Millsap, Chaz Theodore Gallegos, Richard Guerra, Brianna Marie Greer, Lazarus Wilson, Robert Marquise Adams, James Robert Frazier Jr., Jeffrey Eugene Mason, Tyson W. Cobb, Richard Gene Poland, John Todd Bigham, Sophia Molina, Monier Hackett, Fabian Perry, Matthew Begay, Matthew Davis, Hamid Garuni Delche, Volka Horton, Jason Lipscomb, Brian McFarland Bauer, Wendell Tagle, Leonard Hollingsworth, Ronnie Dwayne James, Jay Jackson, Christopher Hansen, Lino Soltero, Deshaun Lockett, Tigerius Holton, Jeffrey Bundret Jr., Juan Mario Gonzalez, Marvin Burke. Name withheld, July 23rd, Sneed, Florida. Mervell Jones Jr., Leonard Brewington, Cody Bennett, William Whitfield, Jonathan Huertas Reyes, Jonathan Allen Worth, Matthew Neal Mitchell, Cole White, John Bomar, Sean C. McCormick, Daniel Robert Strange, Jeremiah C. Jones, Tyrone Jones, Marvin Moran Jr., name withheld, July 26, Palacios, Texas. Aaron Stanton, Kyle Dale, Marcos Maldonado, Patrick Wayne Cater, David Peleas Chavez, Dante Cottrell, Adam Mustafa Yulnes, Charles White, Kevin Hargraves Sherd, Bobby James Brown, Daniel Bruce, Joshua Clayton Hiffler, name withheld, July 30th, Port Richey, Florida. Mark Allen, Darren Baker, Joseph Torres. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain from the Super Duper Uber Mega Ultra Hyper Turbo Multi Maxi Max in Youngstown, Ohio. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
You can still write Sean at his new old new again address at Sean Swain number A243205 OSP Youngstown 878 Coatesville Hubbard Road, Youngstown, Ohio 44505. You can find his past writings, updates on his case, hear his past audio, find out how to get his books, plus ways to contribute to his legal defense fund at seanswain.org.
Souls are made to know the way